Hello, my name is Dan Davis. I'm going to host this episode again, but today I'm going to be talking about the animation studio DreamWorks. Now, DreamWorks has gone into a lot of problems because they have not had a serious hit in a while. Well, actually, they had The Crew. It's just last year, but the last four movies have all underperformed, unfortunately. In order to kind of get to the point of DreamWorks, we got to go back to the beginning. And, DreamWorks, they started out, DreamWorks Animation, to be more specific. And DreamWorks, the first animated film was Ants. Now, Ants, to compare it to Bug's Life, the same year, one of them, Ants is a little more risque in a way.
What year was that?
1998, sorry. 1998. And, 1998 was when Ants came out. And Ants, it was kind of like, when you compare Ants to Bug's Life, which came out a little later, a few months later, Bug's Life was a little more adult in a way. And I don't know if that was necessarily the best thing in the world, but Ants is kind of interesting in the way they animate the ants. Though I would say it's pretty funny, actually. Casting Woody Allen as a very low-life ant was kind of a stroke of genius. And in fact, I think Woody Allen probably did it because he wanted to have a voice work credit to himself. And they got an all-star cast. And DreamWorks, the thing about DreamWorks is that, back in the day, they didn't really care about who celebrities they casted. Like, Tom Hanks is the voice of Woody, but they never really use him in Toy Story all that much for promotion, though they make it apparent. And, DreamWorks, they've always had this kind of bad thing about emphasizing voice casting, in big letters on their posters. And, about Ants is kind of, just the humor is really irreverent in some way. It's just kind of really funny. And it's been a while since I've actually watched Ants, but I watched it a few times. But I remember being genuinely pleased at Ants. And it was a pretty good debut for the company. Though if I had to say which I liked more, Bug's Life or Ants, I'd probably say Ants. Bug's Life is a little more cutesy and kid-friendly in a lot of regard. Ants is kind of keeps that boundary of animated movies then. But it's not really offensive.
What was Ants about?
Ants was about to get to the plot of Ants, it was about a lowly grunt worker named Z who basically who had a crush on the princess, and he wanted to of the ant colony, and basically he wanted to get out and emphasize it, and they did, and the whole thing was about there was basically a betrayal going on, and it was kind of plot-wise for an animated picture that was more emphasis on comedy than it was really story. It was a pretty convoluted plot in some ways. I did enjoy Ants, and it kind of made for good DreamWorks animation-wise. And then DreamWorks, when they started out, traditional animation was still in key. So for DreamWorks, Jeffrey Katzenberg, he'd worked on traditionally animated movies. He greenlit, The Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, Lion King. So, he wanted to emphasize on 2D animation. So DreamWorks made 2D animated films, with all the animated films back then, they were emphasized with 3D animation, in the background, but for cost-cutting measures. But, CGI. And these weren't particularly successful, actually. That's one of the reasons why, because they assumed that 2D animation was going to go the way of disco or whatever.
What's the difference between 2D and 3D?
2D is more like, it's traditional animation, you draw it. 3D is done emphatically on computers. You can tell the difference. 3D films are more like, CGI, 3D, not 3D, CGI films. I don't know why I keep saying 3D, but CGI films, they're, computer generated. CGI animated movies. Animated, but, much greater emphasis on the playing field in most regards. And they made four. The Prince of Egypt was a pretty good musical retelling of Moses. Of all the DreamWorks films, it's the only one that really emphatically tried to do the Disney formula of having songs, really. And it was pretty much their most successful animated feature, traditionally animated. And Then they made The Road to El Dorado, which I did not, my brother saw, and I didn't originally, wasn't interested. It was pretty, there were some pretty funny moments. That one also had songs in it, but they were like, Elton John or whatever did them. And Spirit of the Stallion had some pretty interesting aspects. Of course, in that one they emphasized Matt Damon's voice as the voice of Spirit. And it had a pretty interesting Native American, tribesman whole ordeal. Sinbad was kind of underrated. I mean, it wasn't greatly animated. There was a lot that was kind of silly about it, but it more emphasized was about the adventure than it was really about the story. And it was some pretty cool animation. Even if integrating 2D with 3D, I mean CGI is never really can sometimes lead to really bad disaster. I mean, it kind of makes the film look outdated. And those films, they were pretty good. DreamWorks also made what I believe is their only straight-to-DVD sequel, which was Joseph, King of Dreams, which was basically a continuation of an attempt to capitalize on the Prince of Egypt. And that was pretty good, but you could tell it was kind of more lowbrow animation. And I liked those films, but DreamWorks killed it off because, aside from Prince of Egypt, all three, the three other films, they all underperformed massively. DreamWorks couldn't have constant failures, so they thought with every single animation studio that traditional animation was dying and that CGI was going to take over. And DreamWorks they after they made the traditional animated movies, which I genuinely liked, they made Shrek, and Shrek was a pretty good movie. I liked it a lot more, but Shrek, it's like you've seen it 10 times. It gets kind of old in some ways. It's still pretty good, actually. There's a lot of heart to Shrek, but Shrek kind of made what was for many years DreamWorks' biggest problem: current humor. Shrek is a good movie. It's from 2001, but Shrek has a lot of modern day references, which is always its biggest problem because it kind of feels outdated. I mean, the fact that Smash Mouth did some of the songs. Okay. It's really no different than other films where they had popular bands then doing the music, but even today, just a few years after Shrek came out, it already feels outdated in that regard. The other songs are pretty good. Yeah, Shrek has, but Shrek, it makes references. I mean, how when he's trying to look for the princesses, it's kind of like one of those emphasizingly 90s game shows or whatever. But Shrek, aside from that, is pretty well-hearted, and there's a lot of funny moments. And the chemistry between the animated characters is actually pretty good. Shrek, Donkey, Fiona, Lord Farquaad, hysterical. Shrek was based off a book, believe it or not, but it was loosely based off a book. Because in that one, Shrek was a businessman. Actually, the interesting thing about Shrek is that it was in production for many years. And you want to know who the original voice of Shrek was? Chris Farley was the original voice of Shrek. And actually, originally it was going to be more like the book with Shrek as a businessman, basically. It's about an ogre, but they're hugely different. I mean, even extending the fact that it's just a children's book, so they tried to stretch it. Story-wise, it's still different. Few animated pictures. Actually, DreamWorks, out of all the animation studios, this has kind of been a problem for them, is they release 3 animated films a year sometimes. And you can only clog up so many space times to keep that stuff. And DreamWorks, so they made a sequel to Shrek. Shrek naturally came 3 years after. Not easy to make sequels. And Shrek 2, Shrek 1 was a pretty good movie. Shrek 2 was more hilarious. Shrek 2 featured, it featured a lot of references and culture stuff at that time. But Shrek 2, it kind of, it had the plot, they went to a bigger reach by having Shrek and Fiona go back to her parents, them being furious about her marrying an ogre, and, basically, or at least the king was, furious, and the whole thing was, the fact that they kind of played the whole aspect of having, Prince Charming being the, one of the villains, and the fairy godmother being a bad guy, or, villainous, being the main antagonist. It was pretty cool, Shrek has always been about, basically doing a very parody of fairy tales, more or less, a satire of fairy tales, So, at the end, the ogre lives happily ever after or whatever. In Shrek 2, I mean, I love it when Donkey's, I'm a stallion, baby. He's going around and, they've been turned into like, basically become beautiful. Shrek has become human, yada, yada, yada. And of course, Shrek had Puss in Boots in it, who became a very popular character, Antonio Banderas. Shrek featured, like all the other DreamWorks films, Shrek featured a great voice cast. Mike Myers, Eddie Murphy, Cameron Diaz, Julie Andrews, Antonio Banderas, John Cleese, Rupert Everett, Jennifer Saunders. Kind of, Shrek had they joke around, they got Pinocchio trying to extend his nose, the three little pigs and the big bad wolf, who's basically, wearing mercies or whatever. And Shrek 2 was just, a really fun movie. And it was a big film for DreamWorks. In fact, it is still their highest grossing film to date. Fiona and Shrek, they go to see her parents after getting married. Fiona, she was cursed. She turned into an ogre at night. Now she's permanently an ogre. They go there. The parents aren't exactly happy. And the father especially disapproves of Shrek. But it turns out that the father is, the father's, he's got dealings with the fairy godmother, that the king has gotten dealings with the fairy godmother. So basically, it reveals that Prince Charming was supposed to save Fiona, but Fiona thinks that Shrek has actually turned into Prince Charming because he's tricked her so he can get married to her. And the whole plot is basically, it runs around in a rampage of fairy tales in there. So Shrek 2 was a success. DreamWorks have been doing some animated features. Around the same time, they made what is arguably their worst film, Shark Tale, which kind of had like really infamous basically a CGI, fish version of Will Smith. And I won't get into much detail about that, but it's a pretty poorly done movie that I kind of liked initially. It was actually a big hit for them, but they didn't do any sequels. What was it? And then 3 years later, these Shrek sequels come out 3 years, at least they used to. We get Shrek the Third, and Shrek 3, or whatever. And Shrek 3, I initially thought it was pretty good. Shrek 3, it's just Shrek 3 kind of, the humor is more lowbrow this time. And the story, it's interesting with the whole young King Arthur and, trying to, Prince Charming basically, making a deal with the villains in order to try and get back at Shrek. But, the humor, it's just kind of falls apart. There's a lot more raw humor this time. And it really isn't that funny compared to the first two. Shrek 3 just kind of falls back and makes the tropes of the first two even worse with more pop cultural references, stuff like that. It just wasn't a very good movie. I wouldn't say it's the worst animated film I saw. Like I mentioned, Shark Tale is still the worst animated DreamWorks film in my opinion. And it wasn't even any spectacular animation. Shrek the Third was a film that I could watch, kill 90 minutes, but it wasn't anything to write home about, certainly. And that's Shrek the Third. Shrek Forever After came out 3 years later. DreamWorks still tried to milk the franchise, especially since Shrek the Third left off so big, but left, viewers unsatisfied. Shrek Forever After was an improvement on the third one, but again, it kind of fell into that whole trope of, the imbecilely really rude, crude, really unnecessary humor. The plot was interesting with, basically Rumpelstiltskin, trying to ruin Shrek's life, him trying to, basically making, him changing Shrek's life and him having to redo everything. It was kind of like, a redo of the first film, but only in an alternate universe where ogres ruled or whatever, ogre barbarians. And Shrek having to get the gang back together. Actually, a fun fact about Shrek, another fun fact of Shrek Forever After is they had originally had Tom Cruise, Paul McCartney, and who was it? I think David Schwimmer or something as the voice of Rumpelstiltskin. They wanted them. But they all turned it down, or at one point were approached. In 2005, I saw at Madagascar, And I thought it was a pretty funny film, but it's kind of a little childish. Though there's still hysterical humor. Madagascar, they escape to the wild. They get lost in the wild. And basically, the whole thing is about them basically having survived and their survival skills. And there's the whole emphasis on Alex basically becoming a lion and trying to kill his friends because they're lost from the zoo. And it was a pretty funny movie, but I think kids would probably more appreciate it than adults. Although there's a lot of adult humor, it's kind of childish in a lot of regards. Though it was an undoubtedly success for DreamWorks, so naturally a sequel was greenlit. And Madagascar Escape to Africa went whizzing out in 2008. And Madagascar Escape to Africa was kind of a little bit of an improvement in a lot of ways. You had a more traditional story. They found Alex's parents. They went into the wild. They were trying to find their way back to New York, but they were still stuck in the wild. They ran, and the characters, they all went through changes. There was emphasis on Gloria and Melvin having a relationship. Gloria meeting, this really, really cool and kind of groovy, hippo. And it was kind of, Marty was there, and I love the fact that they made the reference to the first one by having the old lady, the one they ran into while they were out in the city, becoming one of the antagonists and basically leading them in. And, in a way, I think the animation was trying to rip off The Lion King, actually, because Alec Baldwin's character looks like basically a kind of straightened up Scar. And, it's kind of like he's, it's like, he's the main antagonist, basically. He's kind of a jerk. But it's like, yeah. Escape to Africa was a really, it was a pretty good improvement of the first. And then, I remember, I didn't even know they were going to make a third Madagascar, because I remember it being in development for a while. And so, I wasn't expecting anything. And then finally, Madagascar 3, or what it was later known as Madagascar, Europe's Most Wanted, finally got a trailer. So it was finally coming out, because during that time, DreamWorks, the penguins in Madagascar kind of did steal the show in the original, even though their screen time was limited. The way they interacted with each other was pretty cool. So DreamWorks, naturally head off the heels of the success of Madagascar Escape to Africa. They, Jeffrey Katzenberg greenlit a TV series called The Penguins of Madagascar, which was basically meant to be a TV series about the penguins of Madagascar, and King Julian and, Maurice and the lemurs were there. But, yeah. It was basically that. It became a successful TV series on Nickelodeon. Actually, DreamWorks made a deal with Nickelodeon. And they the thing about DreamWorks TV series is they're kind of scattered over different networks depending on the preference. Because DreamWorks, they're owned by Fox now, or at least DreamWorks Animation. So it's like, yeah, no parental network. That How to Train Your... Well, I'll get to that later. But, yeah, that came out, and for a few years we had that. I think it's still running. They're even making a feature film based off of it. But we had that, and then in 2012, Madagascar 3, Europe's Most Wanted, came out. I saw the first two in theaters, but I didn't see the third one. So I was kind of disappointed in that regard. But I imagine, these films, their age groups, kind of grew up about it. But I went and rented it, and yeah, it was a pretty good film, and, it kind of had some heart to it, too. The humor was hallucinated, it had them, they basically ended up in France, they met a carnival circus, they were being chased around by a woman, being chased around by a French officer who wanted them out of Europe. And kind of, they had a great voice cast. Bryan Cranston plays a Russian surviving tiger. And he is totally unrecognizable. And then, you had Martin Short. You could tell it was Martin Short as a French seal. And, you had Jessica Chastain as a French, a French lioness or something. And it was pretty good. And they had this great emphasis, and, you kind of feel for the characters, because, it was the film, the monkeys were another character from the first one who were pretty good as a side character, though though they weren't exactly given a huge role in this one. They were basically the Penguins, and Mel and Marty, Alex, Marty, Melvin, and Gloria all escaped. To get away. They got away from the island, and they were going to go to the zoo. And the ending, it was kind of predictable, but it was kind of cute in a way. And there was a lot of humor there and emphasis, and it felt just warm-hearted, as cheesy as that sounds. So that was the first three Madagascar movies, and so DreamWorks, they're going around, and I like it, and I like DreamWorks, and DreamWorks Animation, initially I saw them as just basically the poor man's Pixar, but by then, they kind of was like DreamWorks. I really saw that they improved and they made more considerable animation in their stories, but they always fell back on the trap of having pop cultural references. So their films, compared to Disney or even Pixar films, feel humongously outdated. They'll probably, that doesn't stop me from enjoying them, but for any other people, they might not get who's that or what the heck are they talking about. So that goes to DreamWorks, and there's a great emphasis placed there. And so DreamWorks, they come along, and when I first heard about the concept of Kung Fu Panda, I was aghast. What? Has DreamWorks really gone that desperate? A film about a karate panda? And Jack Black is going to voice him? What? And everybody was like that. Everybody thought it was going to be a massive fail for DreamWorks because, they always see, DreamWorks is the poor man's Pixar. DreamWorks rips off ideas, DreamWorks, gets a lot of flack from, the general public. I remember reading that on IMDb and people being outgasped at the idea. And the film came out, and it took us all by surprise because not only was it a genuinely funny film, but it had a lot of heart. The characters were really good, and Poe was a pretty good protagonist because he was clumsy. He was a fool, but he was actually, a warrior. He became warrior with training. Obviously, it had a great voice cast, like all of DreamWorks films, Jack Black, Justin Hoffman, Angelina Jolie, Jackie Chan is the monkey. And, it was a pretty cool film, and I liked it and liked the villains and I liked the story and I liked everything about it. I mentioned it already Poe was, about Poe being a warrior who was chosen. It was supposed to be the chosen one. He was raised by a duck. And, they live and he wants to become he wants to become a kung fu master, but he works for, a guy who sells fish, basically. Sells food. And goes to the Master Oolong or whatever, played by Dustin Hoffman, and they train him, and eventually he has to stop the bad guy, Shang or whatever. Ian McShane, played him, and he was escaped, and he's out to get him, and Poe saves the day and proves that he's the chosen one, chosen the greatest warrior. And then DreamWorks, they were quick to greenlight a sequel and a TV series, Kung Fu Panda Legends of Awesomeness or whatever, without Jack Black as the voice of Poe, with a guy doing a fairly pale imitation of him. Okay series from what I've seen, not as good as Penguins of Madagascar. But they made a sequel 3 years later. Jack Black was back again, the rest of the cast. And this time, there was a more emphasis on action because, by then DreamWorks, they switched to 3D, so I think DreamWorks did the perfect job of mixing in, more erratic action, punching and kicking and stuff like that. And you could tell because with the emphasis on 3D, it meant, everything was coming at you. Animated films seemed to know how to do a better balance of 3D versus live action post-converted ones. But it was coming, and basically the plot had a storyline involving Poe trying to find who his real parents were because he had visions of a man. It's pretty cool too. It's actually 2D, traditionally animated. Those dream sequences Poe has about his father are traditionally animated, and it's pretty cool in comparison to the majority of the film being in CGI. But there was that. And you had Gary Oldman playing an unrecognizable crane, swan villain, who basically ruled over this village and was trying, to conquer the world. He was completely unrecognizable. And he's like, he has a really really high-pitched voice. And, you had John Claude Van Damme and Victor Garber as two masters who'd been captured. Yeah, you got some voice talent this time. And it was a great, great emphasis. I mean, Poe and his, team, it was really, really good, and just overall a pretty good movie. Saw it with my Uncle Frank, actually, the first time. I remember being pretty pleased. The movie we saw when he was there at the theaters, we wanted to see one. That came out, but unfortunately financially disappointed, so I'm not sure there's going to be a third Kung Fu Panda, though apparently it's been greenlit. Nothing has ever come of it. They would have done it by now, I'm assuming, because it's 2014. But DreamWorks makes a lot of animated films, and it's kind of like that. So DreamWorks, they made Shrek, they made Madagascar, they made Kung Fu Panda, but all those films I thought were lacking one big thing: heart, right? Real adventure, real feeling, not just emphasis on comedy, not just cool, fun film to watch, to pass the time. They were all pretty good movies, and they were pretty financially successful. And then DreamWorks made in 2010 what I consider, until another film, to be what I think is their best animated feature, How to Train Your Dragon. Now, I kind of mentioned before how all those films lacked a certain something to make them overtly memorable. They were pretty memorable, but How to Train Your Dragon, it's based off a series of books, or a book, but How to Train Your Dragon not only does it introduce a new world, but it creates a mythology within that world. And How to Train Your Dragon has a typical story about a father and son, Hiccup, and he's the son of the leader of the Vikings, stoic, but he doesn't want to be, he doesn't want to be a dragon slayer. He would want to be a Viking. He just likes to draw. And it's basically, it basically has a message about not trusting creatures within their inner appearance, like just the dragons, and there's a whole plot. I'm not going to spoil it for you, but basically, Hiccup finds a dragon, he heals it back. The dragon, he wonders why the dragon doesn't attack him, and then basically, actually, if I'm going to talk about the sequel, I might as well say, film is basically about respecting, coming to terms. It's a really great film from DreamWorks, and it really emotionally was really touching. And I really liked it, and it had, DreamWorks films, it had some pretty great animation, especially with all the dragon designs. And then, I know they were going to make a sequel. This one, it took them 4 years, Making an animated film perfect does not you can't just whip one out within a year. Sometimes, I've been told that if you don't use computers, an animated film can sometimes take up to more than 5 years to make. I remember watching that in a documentary on The Incredibles. But, it's the same thing. They made a sequel to How to Train Your Dragon 2, but in between that time, they made a TV series, Riders of Berk, which was odd because DreamWorks, all their stuff was airing on Nickelodeon. They made a Megamind special that aired on Nickelodeon. They had two Penguins in Madagascar and Kung Fu Panda were on that channel. But Cartoon Network? Didn't they have some sort of deal with Nickelodeon? I thought that was kind of weird. Now all the shows are going to go to Netflix, actually. Riders of Berk's new season is going there. They made a Turbo TV series that played on Netflix, which they greenlit before the movie even came out. So after it financially disappointed, they realized, oh no, oh well. The sequel, I thought the first one was a great film. It was a great film. I thought, the sequel can be just... The best sequels are ones that improve upon the original. But in the emphasis of, you create a universe, and you try to improve and add in more stuff. Now, what is How to Train Your Dragon 2? Well, let's see. We see more dragons. We go into a bigger reach. we take plot points from the first one and we extend upon them. With Hiccup finding out that Hiccup finding out that somebody important in his life is still alive. We added a new villain who isn't like the first one. Human villain. This time, more human villain. And we go around and we introduce, a new region. We extend, we add in plot twists. We go into characters' personal lives, people they knew, stuff like that. Now, How to Train Your Dragon 2 has all of those. So, in some ways, I can say it's more memorable, it's better than the first. It really is, because How to Train Your Dragon was a great movie, but How to Train Your Dragon 2 is a great movie. How to Train Your Dragon 2 gets a perfect 10 out of 10 because How to Train Your Dragon 2 is just a great building mythology of the original. You got the characters, they're going through changes, Hiccup, all of the team, the Riders of Berk or whatever. And there's humor too. I mean, there's lots of funny stuff to laugh at. And I'm such ashamed that How to Train Your Dragon 2 is such an underwhelming financial performer because I really wanted to see a third film, and I don't know if, with Kung Fu Panda 3, if it's just going to end up in limbo now. But they're great sequels. It's a great sequel. I know I can keep gushing over How to Train Your Dragon 2, but it really is one of those sequels that I think is just great. It's, you don't get many sequels because sometimes filmmakers feel the need to, basically they only make a sequel to cash in, but clearly Dean DeBose and co. were obviously trying to make a sequel with intensive heart, unlike Shrek 3 or, any other some other DreamWorks sequels. There was real emphasis in placing, because he felt that he had another point to make about the story, because he knew there was more to extend upon because it's a mythology. It's, mythological fantasy, so there really is an element of extending that. And so DreamWorks makes sequels. They make lots of sequels. I don't think some of them are really wholly unnecessary. In fact, some sequels are just unnecessary overall. So DreamWorks, they made a lot of other animated features too. If a film underperforms, it's not getting a sequel, or they just might feel that the sequel is just unnecessary. I'm actually surprised and happy they didn't make one to Megamind, even though that one did fairly well for them. And DreamWorks, one of their biggest problems, like I mentioned, was they shouldn't release 3 animated movies a year. Pixar only releases 1 on a consistent rate. Next year, they're only going to be releasing 2 because one of them got pushed back. Inside Out and Finding Dory are next year. And DreamWorks, they've run into a lot of really bad problems because of this. So their first real out and about, financial failure was Rise of the Guardians, which lost them like $67 million or something. A lot of money. And despite the fact that, we managed to make back more than twice its budget. But unfortunately, it wasn't enough for Jeffrey Katzenberg, since apparently he must have spent like millions in promotions or whatever. And that film flopping, at the time I thought it was going to be, a blip on DreamWorks' career, because their anime films tend to do pretty well. Though looking back, not as great as I really expected. But that was, just a minor blip in that at the time. But, after that, DreamWorks came back with The Cruise, which was a big success for them. And earlier, I forgot to mention, in regards to the Shrek series, there was one film I forgot to talk about, which was Puss in Boots. So they made sequels, but they never really made a spin-off film. And I really liked, Puss in Boots more than the Shrek 3 or 4, because it was kind of clever. I mean, it was kind of like a Western in a way. Kind of, there was a satirical view in Westerns, and, Puss wasn't like, he was out, and it was kind of like, Western adventure or whatever. I felt like that, or at least. And there was references, and, you had Antonio Banderas, hamming it up occasionally, but a pretty cool movie. And that one did fairly well for DreamWorks. But to get back to DreamWorks' financial problems, so you had The Croods, which was a success for them, But their next movie, Turbo, was not. And that one was okay, I guess, after watching it. But just, it was a financial failure. Even though Jeffrey Katzenberg said it was going to be much more of a profit than Rise of the Guardians, it did not do as well as Rise of the Guardians. So I think he was just talking out of himself. And that did, unfortunately, not very good. And DreamWorks followed that up with Mr. Peabody and Sherman, which opened all right, but reportedly lost them lots of money. Though it's like, they always say, we're losing lots of money opening weekend, jump ship. And of course, there's How to Train Your Dragon sequels, which will probably never happen. Yeah, and then they got a lot of sequels they're greenlighting, and they got projects that they may have canned and stuff like that for business purposes. But DreamWorks, I mean, they're really a good studio. And I'd give them probably a B plus. I'd give Pixar an A, because I pretty much liked all their efforts. But DreamWorks isn't really aspiring to be Pixar, though they occasionally do show fits of trying to imitate Pixar. But Pixar is more clever in a lot of regards. They place more emphasis on human characters. DreamWorks, and especially Disney, though some of their films, DreamWorks places more emphasis on humor, if I had to compare the two. Until How to Train Your Dragon 2, it was always that way. Though their films are still quite good and can be quite clever. It's just that Pixar is more emotional, usually. I cry in some of Pixar's movies. I don't get that same feeling from the majority of the DreamWorks films I've seen. So Pixar is pretty much more superior because they do place that feeling you get. But DreamWorks has not done bad themselves. You might call them out for having inconsistent quality, but I personally think all of their animated pictures are at least fine. Well, excluding Shark Tale, I guess. And Shrek the Third. So yeah, DreamWorks. I can't really gush about DreamWorks because they don't have as many films as I really like, as much as I can about something like Pixar or maybe even Disney Animation Studios. But DreamWorks it's a swell studio. And, well, that's DreamWorks and stuff like that. And bye.